All right, welcome back. So we'll continue on with the shoulder area here. And so again, I could keep cross hatching to get the next darker tone, darker value while adding style. I think I'll bring some up even on this side. So you see that over here, this is where the light would be. So a lot of times it feels awkward to render on the light source side. Remember what I said, that precipice or peak is right about there in the bicep. Well, in that case, the light would really be pretty strong there, but we need to also consider the muscle group is going down and wrapping away from the light. So there needs to be a little bit of value shift right there. Maybe not a lot, but at least a little, I think. And also, you could still make the argument that there would be a little bit of rendering on the very edge because this muscle is not, it's not like it's rounding and then it stops. I can't even do an arrow here. It's not like it's rounding and then it stops flat, right? It doesn't do that. It's rounding away from our view, like a globe, like a planet, right? It's similar to that kind of concept, something spherical. So in that case, you could do some rendering on the very edge. So just keep that in mind. And you'll see a lot of artists do that. So you probably pick up on that, I imagine, but just something to point out that it's okay to get a little bit of that over there. It's not like the side with the light source can have no shading whatsoever. And really sorry that it keeps popping up random file names of other things that I worked on. That's kind of crazy. So let's see, with this spot, let's get this out of here a little bit, clean that up. Now you can also get in the subdivides of the muscles, right? So if there's a little striation right here, you could shadow that independently, or you could just add it as another shape and then add a little bit of like area around it. And I think that still works. It doesn't need to be rendered identically to these other bigger groups. And remember what I said about maybe adding something through this kind of peaked area or another shape that's kind of going like that. You don't have to do it, but it's something, again, I like to do. I think it looks cool stylistically. So I'm going to add that in there. Sometimes I will do a little cheat too when I'm working digitally, and I'll throw these sort of things in. And I go, what would that look like if I put it over here and I rescaled it? And I just play around with the tools like that. So, sometimes it yields a better result. And so we'll get down into the forearm area here. Same thing with this area. I'm going to block this in like this. You can bring these tapered lines really heavy to the sides. What's nice about that is it starts to shadow it this way to this way just by widening or thickening the tapered lines on the shadow side. Again, I can run some little thin lines right through there. Okay, so now with this part of the forearm, I can render up and around. And just to speed this up, I am going to rotate it and take advantage of my own hand mechanics. Again, pulling down feels a lot more comfortable and a little bit quicker. Now, another thing is you don't have to go thick to thin, pointing towards the light in this way. I'm going to show you another method here in a second, which is probably pretty obvious, but you never know what to explain with these videos, what somebody might be questioning and wondering. And that's why if you do have any questions about this process, make sure to comment so I can help you figure it out. It lets me know what to actually answer. So I'm going to cross hatch over here. I feel like this area would be darker. Like that. And another one that's kind of neat is to bring lines up and over. I kind of picture like they're leaning against the other line. So it creates a little bit of a diamond in there. You'll see a lot of people do this really well with a crow quill. I've really mastered that pen. And it doesn't have to be a crow quill. It can be anything, but it looks really good with the natural taper that a croak quill does. When you can master those little suckers. Just like that. And you see that, again, gives another way to kind of round over that forearm muscle. But the other one I wanted to show you is that you could really, you could do it so many different ways. I mean, obviously there's not an infinite amount of ways, but there's a lot. But another one is just like thicker lines. And shoot, they don't even have to be thick to thin. They can just space out. It could be the same line, just slowly spacing out. And this is a really nice look. There's times I really get into applying that sort of shadowing. It almost feels like it would flatten it out, but if you do it in just the right way, especially if you render the other lines this way, you can get this kind of spherical thing going on just by the way that you bend them around like that. And so, I don't know, it's just another neat way to render. I don't do as much of that one for a lot of anatomy, but there's times I do it. Like, so another thing I like to do is really just change up the rendering based upon the scene as well. So if I'm rendering this sort of cross-hatching that I just showed you all through here for the anatomy, I'm not going to use that for the background stuff. I just like that difference from the character to the scenery, you know. And usually it kind of boils down to, if it's something more straight and angular, then I typically use more straight lines to render it as well. So again, a couple little cross hatchings. That I could do those same little angles, but it's probably a bit too tight in that area. And then, so for the veins, it's sort of like wrapping lines, right? And so I generally will draw across this stuff in this way, like real light, and I'll start to try to figure out the shapes. And I really should pull up like a vein chart in one of my anatomy books. I usually don't. I just sort of draw some in. I do a little bit of whiteout through here, and I just sort of might look down at my own arm, and I sort of find some shapes that I typically have used in the past, and that's how I do it. But just keep in mind, there's great anatomy books that you can pull from and see the vein flow, and it's probably for the best, right? You're gonna get that sense of knowledge in your work, which people appreciate. But I've seen a lot of art styles where they do it stylistically, and it looks pretty cool too. But the main thing here is that you think about, again, that underlying form and volume. You got to always think about that as you go. And so then when you draw the veins, they need to look like they kind of roll around that, even as they're doing these kind of zigzag cross sections, this sprawling kind of veiny thing that they do. So yeah, it's kind of tricky because you have to think of a couple things at once, much like everything in comic art. It's like it's not just one thing, right? So figure out the direction of these veins first. Make a few mistakes like I'm doing. Get those mistakes out of the way. Fail faster. And you get the bigger tendons from the wrist area, so you could probably start there. Put some heavier shadows on those. And then spin these out and around. Now, another thing you could do is you put them on another layer, which is what I should have did, because it does make them a lot easier to just draw, especially when you go back and forth from dark to light. The whiteout is much easier, or white digital ink, digital lines. But just keep doing that, and I'll probably have to soft erase this just because it's a bit messy right now. So push this all back so I can see through the mess. And so what you're going to do is just show the way that it's reacting to the underlying forms. So both in the larger way of the way it wraps around spherically, and in the smaller ways of where they overlap and hit one another. Like these tendons here from the wrist. You got a vein that goes over. Well, it's going to create a little pocket of shadow in there somewhere. And you pick back up on the other side. Right, and you just continue a little bit of that. Same thing here. Let me do a negative line right through the shadow. That looks kind of cool. You can also put a little bit of bumpiness to the shadow over here. So for instance, instead of just one smooth line, you can say, well, the vein gets wider here, thins out there, wider here. And you can do that usually with the shadow. You can apply it on the other side as well, but you kind of want to, I don't know, me personally, I try not to draw this line on the other side as much. You can still get it to show with adding the rendering through it, right? And then go back with the eraser and just get rid of the line. Maybe leave just a little hint here and there, but it's, I don't know, it looks really good when you can get confident enough to not need the lines on the light source side as much. So you want to play around with that concept. And then for the vein, you can add just tiny little bits of rendering like that. You can fade those out, pick them back up. Yeah, so many different ways to do it. All right, so we'll go ahead and stop right here. We'll head over to the next lesson and start to ink the lines. So with that, let's move on.